Movie studios that have three letters in their name have always been a fixture of Hollywood. MGM and RKO were there at the start of the movie business, and in recent times, STX can be added to that storied list. The S in STX is Bob Simonds, whose career in Hollywood has taken him from producing movies that have grossed over $6 billion at the box office to launching the studio that brought us hits like Bad Moms, Molly's Game, Hustlers, Greenland, and many others. Bob chatted to me about getting started in Hollywood, making movies with comic geniuses like Adam Sandler and Steve Martin, and reshaping movie distribution at STX. Enjoy. Hi Bob, welcome to the pod.
Thanks for having me.
My absolute pleasure. I always like to start with a fun question.
Okay.
And in this case, I want you to share that I love action movies. And one of my recent favorites was actually the STX film Greenland, in which a comet is going to wipe out the civilization and the planet, and the authorities have to choose people to escape to the bunker in Greenland that will keep them safe and allow them to repopulate the Earth. So if you were in charge of choosing one creative genius from the movie business to make it to the bunker and help to maintain humanity's creative spirit, who would you choose?
Wow. Actually, I wasn't prepared for that question. Who would I choose? Well, I guess this is a sort of a boring answer, but you probably go with Spielberg, just because for such a long window, his films touched so many people all over the world, and he's probably, for that window of time, a really good populist commercial representative of the most appealing aspects of the emotion associated with films. You know, there's a lot of really, really talented artists that I would go after, but the truth is that you start to work your way down into a wormhole. Then, you know, as you know, movies are truly just an emotional transaction. It's you pay me money, and I'll change the way you feel. I'll scare you. I'll get you excited. I'll make you laugh. It's a bit like a glass of wine or a drug. It's a transaction. You know, box office is a function of a lot of different things, but ultimately it's a way of keeping score, meaning enough people kept recommending it and it just kept touching a lot of people. So I guess I'd probably have to go with that, which is such a boring answer.
Well, it's tough being in charge in the Greenland scenario. So I think it's a choice that probably most people would make. So I'm completely with you on that.
Hopefully in the Greenland scenario, you get, 20 choices, at which point they could be a lot more interesting.
Absolutely. Well, Spielberg's been going for a while, and I suppose that then begs the question, did he and other filmmakers help you fall in love with the movies when you were a kid growing up in Arizona?
Oh, sure. I talk about that emotional transaction. I mean, like, I was of that generation when, speaking of Spielberg, Jaws came out. I was afraid to go in a swimming pool. I mean, I was just afraid. But there was always something about movies that, as a kid from Arizona, there was a magic to it. There was almost like a sacred holiness to it. I remember my first job when I was a kid, and I was an intern at MGM, and I used to work. And it was the old MGM lot, which is now the Sony lot. And what was fascinating was that I would wander through, I'd stay late and I'd wander through those sort of misty streets at night. And it was like being in church. It was a really interesting sort of emotional dynamic. So when I came out to Hollywood, again, I focused on, I wanted to be in the movie business, and I wanted to produce movies, partly because I can't write and I can't direct and I certainly can't act. So I like the idea of being the guy who kind of willed things into being. You take this idea and you try to build it. You supply the financing for it. You supply all of the stuff that you need. And then ultimately, it needs to be seen by people. So you need to make sure that it's marketed and distributed. I sort of focused on high concept, low budget teen movies, partly because I was a good 20 or 30 years younger than everybody else in Hollywood. And I, either accurately or not, believe that if I focused on movies that were for a teen audience, that I would have a little bit more credibility in terms of, quote, this is what they want to see. But, I focus again on high concept, low budget, because as a producer, I knew that if it was an expensive film, I would be replaced by a real producer who actually needed to manage a big and proper budget. And it was high concept because if I needed a big star in order to get it made, at that point in my career, I would have been replaced because a big star needs a big and real producer. So I kind of reverse engineered how can I make movies? How can I actually be a producer producing movies without being replaced? And then just kind of like reverse engineered the whole thing.
So, as a producer, your films have generated more than $6 billion in worldwide revenue, which is pretty impressive. So, you talked about that early internship and the types of movies that you were focusing on, but how did you actually make that initial move and started to build those relationships and get into the business?
So before creating STX, yeah, I was an individual producer. So yeah, we did about a little over 6 billion in revenue. What I sort of touched on that a little bit in terms of the kinds of films I was focusing on, but what again reverse engineered. What I realized is that I was a liability in the process because I wasn't really bringing much value other than connectivity. So I'd come up with ideas, and then I would think, "Oh, this is a good idea for a movie." And then what I would do is I would go after sort of equally green but very hot writers. And I had enough connection to the studios where I could talk to their development executives and kind of find out who they wanted to be in business with. And okay, so you want to be in business with this writer and this writer and this writer. You're looking for an excuse to be in business with that person. So I would go to that writer and I'd say, here, take the idea. If you like it, take the idea. It's yours. And you and I will go into the studio. And the studio will hire you to write this because it's a cool idea and they'll like it and you seem to like it. And then as the liability, I'll be attached as the producer and set up a staggering number of those because I used to always say movies beget movies, but also selling pitches beget selling pitches. So I ended up doing that for quite some time, and then the first one started to convert. I think my first movie was Problem Child, which was Alexander Karaszewski who wrote the screenplay. It was basically like, how do we do Bad Seed as a comedy? Alexander Karaszewski went on to become and are today some of the most lauded, talented writers working in Hollywood right now. They're just world class, awesome on every level. But yeah, when we were floundering around trying to get Problem Child made, it was them. Again, everybody wanted to work with them. We were pitching, we were working on the idea with them, and Universal bought the pitch. We developed it, and it's funny because at the time you go, well, this is ideal for like Steve Martin, who I ended up doing a bunch of movies with later on. But at that point, Steve was like, I don't know who you are. I'm not, and we kind of ended up with John Ritter. But again, you're talking about a very different star profile than somebody like a Steve Martin. But it was a great way to get my to sort of figure out the process. And Ritter actually was ultimately great because he had so much audience goodwill, and you actually believed him and he was just genuinely funny. But yeah, we became the most profitable studio film of 1990, even though the movie itself, and Scott and Larry would actually admit this, was a bit of a mess. It was lots of reshoots and lots of us figuring it out and lots of just kind of turned into a full contact sport, but we didn't know any better. And ended up doing a bunch of other movies with Scott and Larry. Did a bunch of movies with Dennis Dugan, who directed it. I ended up doing both Happy Gilmore and Big Daddy with Dennis, who is, again, super funny, super talented, and kind of just knows where the joke is.
And those movies, of course, were Adam Sandler movies, who was an early talent partner. Getting into the Adam Sandler business must have been, at the time, really exciting. And then subsequently, box office gold in many ways.
I think I did 8 or 9 movies with Adam, and he's still one of my closest friends. He is a lot like the guy you'll see on screen. He's ridiculously smart. He's really funny, like all the time, funny, all the time. Ferociously loyal, honorable, and has on his own built a business. Yes, I did Nine with him, but that was me hanging out with Adam and sort of being part of his magic, which was awesome. But I don't think people realize is that Adam is at the epicenter of all that he does, and his personality and his ethos sort of permeate everything, which is why I think his movies have consistently been so beloved by the audience. Movies take on the personality of the person in charge. They just do. And when you have a guy like Adam in charge, it becomes like that's his personality. He's a guy you just want to kind of hang around with and laugh. But when we first started out, the studios were ironically really resistant to his brand of comedy and the approach to making films. So, when we were doing Billy Madison, then Happy Gilmore, then Wedding Singer, then Waterboy, I mean, the truth is, if we hadn't been one step ahead in forcing the movies to get made, we probably wouldn't have gotten them made. But he was so driven, and we were able to do so much on the fly that his voice was able to sort of push through despite the studios not necessarily fully embracing until they're like, what is this? And, it's funny because I would say, not to take anything away from the directors that he's worked with, because he's worked with a number of really talented comedy directors, but, he kind of ghost directs a lot of what he does. And if you were to add up his grosses and gave him credit for sort of ghost directing, the simple truth is he's probably the highest grossing director ever.
So he went on to have a long-standing and very successful relationship with Sony Pictures, but ultimately ended up making movies for Netflix in his most recent part of his career. Is his move to Netflix a reflection, do you think, of the general trend of stars producing more movies for streamers? The power of the streaming algorithm that probably on Netflix's side meant that they could demonstrate that his movies really, really work for their audience? Or is it a specific trajectory for the kind of comedic features that Adam makes that seem to be getting less of a theatrical release right now? Or is it something of all of those things?
So I think it's a great question. So you probably have gotten a lot of different opinions on this. It used to be the question of like, what is a movie? Is a movie a theatrical release, or is it a movie if you do it and you get paid a lot of money to make it directly for a streamer? I mean, there's a certain approach to what a theatrical film is, and all that means is that for the rest of its life, for the rest of its next 10, 20 years of people watching it, and whether they watch it on TV or eventually on streaming or cable or on their phone, that the film was perceived in its creation as good enough that it would drag you out of the comfort of your own home, across town, having to go through all of this, frankly, discomfort to actually partake in this, experiencing this content. So there was that sort of patina that theatrical releases used to have. I think the streamers have done an amazingly successful job, particularly with their awards campaigns, of breaking that. So you can get really intense quality from streamers, as evidenced every time you have an award season. But it's also how do you like to experience the content. So Adam's stuff is genuinely funny, genuinely heartwarming, and it's like a comfort food. So being able to enjoy that in your own home is perfect. But let's be clear, Adam's got a lot of different voices in him, and he's now expanding. So we've all seen what he could do in Uncut Gems, and I don't know if you saw his last Netflix movie Hustle, which is just exceptional. And again, if that had gotten a theatrical release, I think more people would have been talking about it. But as a piece of material, it's exceptional, and he's exceptional in it. I'll make about 15 movies this year. I'm making about 15 films a year. Most of it's star-driven, partly because we find that when we build a movie around a star, it allows us to know who we're marketing the film to. So unlike having to shotgun and convince everybody on the planet, to be aware of this film, it's much easier to say, well, if you haven't seen a Kevin Hart film, or you haven't seen a Vin Diesel film, or you haven't seen this, then I don't necessarily have to hammer you. But it's a way of us saving, 60, 70% on our marketing costs. But when you're doing that kind of volume, the optionality is really important. So we try to build everything as a theatrical release, meaning you're going to release it theatrically in 3,000 screens domestically and all over the world. And then depending on what happens in the world, Greenland, I thought was an excellent film. Rick Romanois and Jerry Butler did a fantastic job on the film. And we released the movie in 30 or 40 different countries internationally. It actually did better than the Olympus series internationally. But when it came to domestic, we couldn't actually release it here because the theaters were in turmoil. So we ended up doing a hybrid deal where we were able to do a massive deal with HBO Max and then do a premium video on demand. And the film was hugely lucrative. So we're obviously doing a sequel. But that kind of optionality didn't exist, a couple of years ago. And that's one where even a movie that probably would have been a big hit theatrically, if we had followed the traditional model, would have worked. But there are a bunch of other films. I've got 5 right now going with streamers that are just direct to streamers, and they're highly lucrative. They'll be the streamers are being incredibly supportive, and that's just stuff that just didn't exist in the past, where it was like you only had one way of telling your story and getting it out to the world, and now you can work with the talent to constantly sort of question what's our best approach here, and that's actually kind of really exciting.
And so having that relationship with Adam and also the other talent-led movie making, or that talent-led movie making approach that you talk about, involves working with very talented people, both in front of and behind the camera. And working with high performance individuals is tough at times. And it can be in the movie business, it can be in the sports field, in the music business, doesn't matter where it is. How have you learnt to be a great manager and partner with high performance and highly talented individuals?
I think the first thing is to acknowledge, it's a great question. I think the first thing to acknowledge is that guys like you and I can we're behind the camera, we're moving money around, we're moving pieces around. Their face is out in front of everything. And the fear of humiliation is always there. So our job is to build a machine that's supportive of them and supportive of what they're trying to achieve. So I think if you acknowledge that they're the tip of the spear, it's their face out there, it's their reputation that's visible out there. When a movie works, they appropriately get a lot of credit. And then sometimes the director and the other people will be able to slipstream on some of that credit. When things don't work, and a film either flops or just doesn't come together, they still get blamed. It's still them going like, you chose poorly or you did a bad job or whatever. And rarely in those flops do the director and the producer actually get dragged through the mud. So I think once you acknowledge that it's a scary place to be and it's a big responsibility for you to make sure that they're protected, I think that's actually a big part of the mind frame on how you approach the decisions. And again, from my standpoint, I try to focus on star and signature roles. So it can be a Jennifer Lopez in something like Hustlers. It can be Mila Kunis in Bad Moms. It can be Jessica Chastain in Molly's Game, or it can be Jackie Chan in The Foreigner, or I seem to be working a lot with Guy Ritchie, and he'll have certain actors that he likes to work with, and you then kind of build the film around their voice.
And you were able to produce and be involved in franchise movies in your earlier career, like The Pink Panther, you mentioned with Steve Martin, Herbie Reloaded, which is obviously a really strong brand in movie history. How does an independent producer become associated and involved with those existing franchises and brands?
Well, to me, it was always it's an interesting question, and I hadn't really thought about it. It was that, to me, it was before actually having a studio and using the studio's marketing. It was always like, because those of us at that time in our careers, you sit behind the P&A, you sit behind the marketing expenses. And those things usually would be really inefficient and really expensive. And you could have a massive hit and still not see much upside. And what I realized is that you could reduce the marketing spend and also reduce a little bit of the uncertainty if you had a pre-existing proven piece of IP that has proven that people are interested in it. So yeah, I did a lot of, whether it was Pink Panther, Cheaper by the Dozen, Yours, Mine, and Ours, That Darn Cat, Leave It to Beaver, Herbie. So what I would do is I would go in and say, okay, there's an idea here, but how do we reinvent it? How do we make it relevant to today's audience? So the Cheaper by the Dozen would be too many kids equals chaos. And in that situation, you get, the ultimate American dad, which is either Tom Hanks or Steve Martin. Steve Martin was the dad everybody wishes they had, and you find a universal theme to reinvent the too many kids equals chaos, and then we ended up like literally casting the movie so that we knew how to market it. So I had an idea that I knew people were interested in. You get Steve Martin and his audience. We hired kids from Nickelodeon so we could advertise in Nickelodeon, brought in Ashton Kutcher so we could go after the MTV crowd. I had just done Just Married with Ashton, so said, hey, you get to do your scenes with Steve Martin, and Ashton is super smart, super cool, stepped in and nailed it. Hilary Duff had the Disney Channel. So we actually, again, a lot of these things, it sounds ugly and less creative, but there was a lot of retrofit going on there. When it came to things like Pink Panther, that was a dangerous one. And it worked because you've got a guy like Steve Martin who is just truly a genius, and yet he was stepping into the shoes of another genius, Peter Sellers, and that's a potentially dangerous place for the star to go. Oh my God, he's going to be compared to Peter Sellers. He's going to be this. That's a bad place for talent to have to step in. Unless you step back and you say, okay, well, I know that's the way you're going to think because you should. What if we reinvent Clouseau in the same way that you've had different characters play James Bond, and you've had different characters play Hamlet, you've had different characters play Batman. You sort of condense the ethos of that character down into something, and then you customize it to the strengths of the actor that you've got playing it. So Steve Martin wrote that Pink Panther, and he wrote it to his strengths. And I suspect he was very, very careful to never do a joke that was similar to one that Sellers did. And I really liked that movie. I thought he was awesome in it. But those are the kinds of things you try to pay attention to.
So I read that you have been in the past offered 2 studio chairmanships, and that didn't interest you. And I suppose then is the corollary of that, that's the reason why you started your own studio, and what was that process that came to fruition?
I think you hang around Hollywood long enough, they offer you a chairman job, which I think is not as rare as it sounds. But yes, no, from my standpoint, when you start out, it was like an achievable pinnacle of, like, it was the brass ring. And the more time you spend in the process, the more time you understand what's actually going on, how things are actually getting done, where the power actually lies, where it doesn't lie. The job is less attractive than it sounds. And from my standpoint, making movies is fun. Sitting, when you're sitting in the room with some of the funniest, most talented people on the planet, and getting to laugh or get excited and just be part of that experience, it's like the coolest job on the planet. So for me, most of what I was trying to do with forming STX was to sort of intensify that experience, but also give us the ability so that we had more control over marketing, more control over distribution, and more control over the stuff that, if nothing else, would just make the process more fun. And, I was blessed when we first formed STX that, S was Simonds, T was TPG, and X, it was a big experiment. It was a big exploration of how do we actually make content, star-driven content, in a world where the traditional studios couldn't. There was that experience. There was that sort of feeling that movies in the middle weren't working. That you were either doing a giant Marvel movie, a giant DC movie, a giant event movie, which frankly America is better than anybody on the planet at sort of globally distributing, or you were making these very sort of like intimate, intense art films. But that middle, which is what most people came to Hollywood to make, was just not working at the box office. But it was more importantly not working financially for the studios, partly because I keep coming back to marketing and distribution expenses, partly because if you're making a 20 or $30 million film, okay, that should work, except for the fact that you're going to spend $60 million because that's the way your machine is built to try to market it. So next thing you know, you're losing money on all these things. So you stop making them. And that's where I saw the opportunities. I was going to step in and say, okay, how do we release Upside and make money? How do we release Molly's Game and make money? How do we release I Feel Pretty with Amy Schumer? Very profitable film for us. But another studio having released that probably would have, so we made a bunch of money. Another studio probably would have lost $15-20 million on the exact same film. So that's why I kind of went after that space. And I think that going forward, there's still an opportunity for those kinds of films. But my thinking has evolved, rightly or wrongly, into feeling like having unilateral access to marketing and distribution, where you don't actually have to pick up the phone to say, I want to release this film. Because if you do, it's going to be very tough to put films together, because always in the back of their mind, they're going to be talking to you going, well, why am I talking to you? I mean, I like you. Maybe I like your ideas, but kind of if yes doesn't mean yes, why am I talking to you? So that's always the thing that needs to be preserved. But in the process, the more you can become an asset-light IP engine, I think this is a perfect time to be an arms dealer. There are so many very deep-pocketed, not just streamers, but outlets that are still competing with each other, that if you can be the IP dealer, that's a good place to be, at least for the foreseeable future.
And if you had a time machine and you could go back to your younger producing self at any stage of the career, maybe at the beginning of STX, maybe right at the beginning of your producing career, with the lessons that you've learned over the course of time, what would you say, and what advice would you give to your younger self?
Most importantly, I would say to my younger self, it's all going to work out. So stop stressing out. Like probably most people you talk to, the number of nights you lay in bed sweating and panicking over stuff that's not a productive emotion, by the way, I would have said it's all going to work out. It's all going to be good. And then in hindsight, one thing, when I built STX, we were originally, from day one, we were geared towards trying to go public as fast as possible, ideally on the Hong Kong exchange, which is why I took investments from Lenovo and Honey and PCCW and Tencent and Alibaba, and it was all geared towards that. And I kind of dilly-dallied longer than I should have. Goldman and JP Morgan were taking this out, and the entire the business thrust was to do that, and I kind of dragged my feet too long, and by the time I was weeks out, the Chinese market was collapsing, and it caused a whole series of scramblings that I've had to deal with now for a while. But at least on the STX standpoint, I probably would have said, just if that's what you're going to do it and get it done fast. I'd probably say that to myself.
I know you didn't want to do the whole what your lockdown media would be. I'm not calling it lockdown anymore because I want all that to be in the past. But if you had to pick one piece of cultural connection, if you got to be in the Greenland bunker and they said you're coming with us along with Gerard and the team, what would you want to have with you to keep you company?
Probably making a choice of something like Will Durant's History of Philosophy, or again, not to sound religious, whether it's the Bible or the Quran. I mean, these are the underpinnings of Western culture. My guess is it'd be probably something like that. I don't, think there's any one piece of film that sort of encapsulates everything. I mean, you can always go back and say, well, Citizen Kane, or Godfather. I mean, these things are just perfect. They're just perfect. But to me, it'd be just kind of like having some cultural touchstone to what our values were at that time.
Well, Bob Simons, thank you so much for being a guest on the podcast. It's been fascinating.
Thank
And
you.
we'll look forward to you being the person who thinks about what advice you would have got or given to yourself, and now are using that to take the business forward.
Thank you so much, and thank you for your time.